Welcome to another episode of Systematic Geekology. This is a space where we seek to create and cultivate healthy conversations between those things we geek out on and the philosophical and theological questions that often arise out of our fandoms. Like, what does it mean to be human? What makes a hero? What makes a villain? How do the stories and narratives we geek out on shape how we live in the world? We are your priest to the geeks. We aren't all ordained, but we see ourselves as mediators at the intersection of geek culture and going deeper in our faith. We don't always have to agree, but we do respect each other, and we see everyone as a beloved child of God. Everyone geeks out on something, so come geek out with us and enjoy the show.
You're listening to an Anazao Ministries podcast.
Jesus be Jesus if he could squirt slime out of his ears. Extraterrestrials have captured the imagination. Think of C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Space Trilogy to explore the question of how Jesus might relate to aliens. Now, multiverse variants are having a moment. From absolute Batman to zombie Deadpool. How different might the incarnation look on Earth inhabited by sapient sauropods or reigned over by robots? Or was Jesus singular, dying once for all the multiverse? Those are the questions we're taking up today. Hello, my name is Justin Coleman, and I'm going to be one of your hosts. I am joined together by the amazing Andy Walsh from Earth 1218. We're going to be your hosts today. Andy, what are you geeking out about lately?
Well, we are recording this on Thursday the 19th, which means just a few hours ago, the trailer for the new Superman movie debuted. I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at it, but I was online right there at 9:00 when it premiered. And man, oh man, I will be in line July 11th. Take my money. Let's go,
dude. That's exactly where I was going to go. Now, I've not seen it yet, so I've been hunkered down in meetings, and so I haven't seen it yet. So no spoilers there. But I'm super excited about that. Very much geeking out about that. I don't know that I'm quite geeking out about anything else, but I know we've got a new Star Wars property that I'm probably going to watch at some point. It's taking me a minute because of the place where I am with Star Wars right now. But I think Superman is the place to geek out about today.
I hear you. I'll also throw out, my son turned me on to this Amazon show called Secret Level. They're little animated shorts that are extending video game worlds. There was a very, very unusual Pac-Man episode that we watched, and a Dungeons and Dragons episode. I guess it's not just video games; it's all kinds of games. So they're these little anime or animated shorts. Opening up those different kind of game worlds that was pretty cool. So we'll be checking out more of that.
Oh, that sounds very cool. I got to check that out myself. Well, we also want to take a moment to thank everyone who supports us. If you're on a laptop, please consider rating and reviewing our show on Podchaser or Good Pods. This will help our show gain recognition and be easier to find on search engines. If you're on your phone, please consider rating, reviewing, or commenting on our show on Apple Podcast or Spotify. This will help prioritize our show in these apps algorithms. So thank you in advance for all of your support. And we want to give a big thanks to the seasonally named Annette Noel, one of our much appreciated supporters. If you'd like a shout out, remember you can have your own if you support us by offering $3 a month on Apple Podcast, Captivate, or Patreon. We'd love to give you a shout out. All right, friends, on to the main event. How different can Jesus be across the multiverse? Alternate futures and realities have been a holiday staple for a very long time. One of my favorite annual traditions is reading and watching as many adaptations of The Christmas Carol as I can. You also have shows like It's a Wonderful Life. Multiverses have been a bigger and bigger part of the zeitgeist these last years. So if all possible universes exist, does that mean that there are universes where Jesus was never born, or maybe Jesus sinned, or Jesus died of old age, was a sapient female pterosaur? There's so many possible options out there as we think about it. So I kind of want to get in by saying, Andy, so what's your connection to these questions?
Yeah, so I think I really started wondering about the issue when people talked about in an infinite multiverse, everything happens and every choice can go both ways or whatever. So it's like, all right, well, what does it mean? If I'm a Christian in this universe of the multiverse, what does it mean? Does that mean that I've doomed somebody else in another part of the multiverse to not be a Christian because they had to make the opposite choice, another version of me? Questions like that, and then that kind of leads to, well, if I'm different, how different can other people be? How different can God's interaction with the world be? To what extent is God bound by the cause and effect and the rules of physics that obtain in a particular universe, versus how much can he intervene? Is God, does salvation work just fine? The plan of salvation work just fine in any universe in the multiverse because God is imposing that from the outside or bringing that in from the outside, and so it doesn't matter all these other kind of variations or whatever. So that, those are thoughts that I've had for a while. It seems like I should also point out. I wrote a book that has the word multiverse in the title. The camera is not playing nicely here, but it's called Faith Across the Multiverse. It's not actually as much about the multiverse as the title would suggest. That was taken from just one of the chapters of the book, and the publisher decided that was the title they wanted to go with. It uses the multiverse, takes the multiverse not as necessarily a literal physical reality, because we don't know if that's the case or not, but as a conceptual idea, right? The idea of different versions of us, and the thought that Jesus is pursuing us across all the different versions of ourselves to find that best version of ourselves, and then calling us to be that version. Was the way that I kind of explored the topic there. So that's a little bit about my kind of background, where I'm coming from on the multiverse. How about yourself?
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic for me, because oftentimes in Christian conversation, we think about history almost as a set of blocks that are built on top of one another, or connected Lego pieces. So you mentioned cause and effect. This happened, and then this happened, and this happened, and history is going to stack up through to the end of Book of Revelation and new creation, and everything has to be lined up in a certain order. And because things have been lined up in a certain order, Jesus had an advent that was necessarily going to come at a certain time, and Jesus will have a second coming that will be at a fixed point in time because of all the things that are stacked up along the way. That's how some people think about it. But even in our own reality, much less the rest of the multiverse, there's been this question for me about, well, so we have a sense of a picture of the second coming of Christ described very poetically in the book of Revelation. Is it that we've got a certain set of events that must be lined up to get there, or something else going on? Is God existing in time and space differently than we can perceive? And that's how God knows what is what is to come. So there's some questions just there, but I love this idea of the multiversal options created by free will. And if every moment of a decision for every person creates a number of different possibilities in the multiverse, I've just been interested in how free will could shift the history of the world, and if there are a set of building blocks that move from the creation to new creation, could those building blocks look different? And could God show up in different ways based on those different building blocks? So those questions have been to the back of my mind just because I enjoy this whole multiversal conversation.
Yeah, and I think that what if question is so natural to humans, right? We even see it in the Bible, right? Before anybody that we know had a notion of a multiverse, right? You see in the book of Esther, right, entertaining the idea of, well, what if Esther doesn't stand up? God will still find a way to save his people. Jesus, if these people don't praise me or don't worship me in this way or don't celebrate in this way, the rocks themselves will cry out, right? That there are multiple paths to get to the same outcome, and God can explore any and every of those paths as needed to accommodate free will. Is the impression one gets from those texts.
Absolutely. Well, okay, so let's continue to dig in here a bit and talk about some of the scientific ideas about the multiverse, and Annie, I'm gonna lean heavily on you here because you've done a lot of this thinking. So, we already have a sense that there are other regions of space beyond that we can see. There are questions about quantum theory and how that might affect worlds and realities, and inflationary theory and different laws of physics. Talk to me a little bit about how you understand those things as you've done a little bit of research and work in these areas.
Sure. Yeah. So the most natural or the most obvious kind of question or approach to a multiverse, and some people might not even apply the word multiverse here, right? But we know that we live in a part of space-time that we can see out to many billions of light years away, because light has been traveling that long. The universe has existed post Big Bang that long. And that kind of creates a bound on, but there was a moment of Big Bang, right? There's a backwards moment. And so light can only have been traveling for so long. And so that puts a limit on how far out into space we can see. And that's usually referred to as the Hubble volume. So we are in the middle of the Hubble volume that's kind of defined by what we can see. And we have no particular reason to think that space just ends at that border, right? And in fact, because space is now expanding faster than the speed of light, there are things that used to be potentially within our Hubble volume that have passed outside of it, because the light from it can no longer get to us. So there's at least some border or some margin there where we know that there are things that exist that we cannot see anymore. And so how far does that extend? It could extend infinitely. Or it could fold back on itself. We've looked for evidence of space-time being curved in such a way that it could curve back on itself. So far, our best measurements say that it's not, that it's pretty flat in all directions. And so, it could end somehow, right? There could be some kind of wall, some kind of something, but we don't really know what that looks like. We have no evidence of that. And so it's natural to just imagine that it goes on indefinitely. But we also have this idea that comes from work that Stephen Hawking and Jacob Bekenstein did on black holes, that tells us that if you have a volume of space, the area of that volume is proportional to the amount of information that's needed to describe what's going on inside that volume, right? That there's not an infinite amount of information that you would need to describe what's going on, but some finite limit on the amount of information that you need. Which means that if you draw these different spheres around different regions of space, that finite number of bits, should repeat, right? If space goes on long enough, there should be another volume of space that has requires exactly the same bits in the same configuration to describe it. And so that's led some people to say, well, if you go far enough, and you can even put a number on it, and it's some absurd number of light years that we can't even fathom, much farther than we could actually see or travel. But if you go far enough, there should be another Hubble volume size space that's exactly like ours, because the bits that you need to describe it should repeat. Whether the space actually works that way or not, we don't know, right? There could be other rules that are actually mean that most of the interesting stuff is happening here or not, but there's no reason to think that. And so that kind of says, well, there's potentially many copies of you and me having this exact same conversation way out there. But then the question is, how different could that be, right? We don't really know what the different possibilities are. We can just kind of say how far you'd have to go before you get to another identical copy. So that's one version of multiverse thinking.
It's just if I could just pause there.
Yeah,
it's cool to think about. So you think about, people talk about mirror universes, right? And that notion of being a set of mirrors, where we've all seen this before, right? Some even have been in mirror scenarios where you can see this, where you just seems like you go on, your image goes on infinitely, or seemingly infinitely, and it's the same image, maybe moving at a slight delay across the further down it goes, but that there's a almost exact replica working with a very similar set of variables. That's fascinating to think about.
Yeah. And it also, you're talking about, mirror worlds and similar worlds, right? That it's very similar to the idea. So I'll just go on to the many worlds idea from quantum physics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The first one, we have some sense that space goes on, right? And so that's where that idea comes from. We don't know how far, and that's why we don't know how many, there might not be other copies of us, but it seems like there could be. The many worlds interpretation of quantum physics is more speculative. There are multiple interpretations of what quantum physics means at a sort of like ontological level, what is happening, what's the fundamental reality of what's going on. And one possible interpretation is that every time there's a measurement event, every time there needs to be a decision about what is happening at a more macroscopic level, and the classic example being the Schrodinger's cat, right? Is the cat alive or dead in the box? Every time that needs to be decided, in the many worlds interpretation, the wave function of the universe branches, and one branch goes off where the cat's alive, and the other branch goes off where the cat is dead. And so this is the model that really leads you to think about that every choice that's being made is creating branching timelines that all coexist in parallel. Now, there is a question of which kinds of choices are quantum, right? So our conscious decisions that represent our free will, they might have some correspondence to a quantum event going on in the neurons of our brain, or they might not, in which case they might not branch worlds in the same way, right? So there's some questions there as to what exactly are the decisions that are creating these branch points. And of course, we don't know if this is actually the correct interpretation of quantum physics. But I think this is the version that people are thinking about most often when thinking about parallel worlds, is this idea that every decision creates this kind of branching point where somebody one version of me goes off in one direction and the other version goes off in the other direction. And I think that also is what really raises the questions of the morality and theology and so forth of, well, at every point did Jesus have decisions? Are the branches of the universal wave function where Jesus made different decisions? or were different decisions that led up to Jesus, different events that led up to Jesus's arrival, mean that he looked different, or he wasn't born, right? I mean, or wasn't born in exactly the same way at the same time, right? And how much did God have to intervene to make things go a certain way, right? How much can God influence the branching of the wave function, right? I think these are all the questions. This is where a lot of those questions, I think, most naturally arise.
Right. Yeah. So it's one thing to talk about the idea that there are these, mirrors that are almost exact mirrors across and just kind of repeating. But the idea of the many worlds, I mean, we do this kind of speculation all the time, not even thinking about this idea of the multiverse very much. But so I was in a conversation just this week where someone was saying to me, as they were thinking about people who steal food from grocery stores. That was the ethical question that had come up, and this fellow who's never done any of that in his life said, if it was a choice between watching my kids starve and just tucking a few things away in my pocket, he said, you know what, I would probably do that. And he said, look, I'm a Christian. I don't believe in stealing at all. Yet in that scenario, the care for my child would be the overriding ethic. Mm-hmm. And then he went on to say, he said, it's just easier. Questions like that make it easier for him to imagine how, if he'd grown up in different circumstances, if he had a different life situation, how he could make choices that his current version of himself would say, gosh, that's not very virtuous at all. Mm-hmm. But in another version with a different setting, I say, I'm just trying to survive, man.
If you'd like to support our show on Captivate, feel free to go to captivate.fm and find our show, subscribe. You'll get access to any future online D&D campaigns over there. You'll get an extra bonus question for 4 to 8 times a month. You'll get extra content like that through there. You also get a one-time donation you could make to help support the show right on Captivate. So you don't get anything for the one-time donation, but if you would like to just support the show once, do a quick donation, you can do that through captivate.fm. Our overhead includes editing software, marketing, equipment, recording software, and a whole lot of other stuff. And we really appreciate everybody who can help keep the lights on.
So we do that kind of multiversal thinking, entertaining this many worlds, even without doing so explicitly, as we think about those kinds of ethical situations.
Yeah, exactly. Those kinds of what if questions, just come so easily, so readily. And I think that's one of our human superpowers, right? Is that ability to think about counterfactuals, and those sorts of things, because it allows us to imagine things that we can then bring into reality in a way that our dogs and cats and other animal friends don't necessarily seem to be able to quite think in that level of abstraction, or that level of departure from the sensorial world that we're inhabiting.
Well, and so you think, as you talk about imagining, let's talk a little bit more about imagining. One of the ways that we create different universes to inhabit for periods of time is through fiction. It's one of the gifts of being able to read or to watch a show on TV or a movie, is to inhabit that space for a while and inhabit an alternate story, even alternate universe. And there have been some really fun fiction, even here recently, that kind of help us to do that. So we think about these singular points of divergence, like Fringe or Counterpart or For All Mankind. For All Mankind has been one of my favorite shows recently because of this very concept. And for those who are not familiar with it, the premise is, what would have happened if the United States wasn't first to the moon? What if then the USSR? What if we were beaten to the moon? How would that shape the identity in the United States? And so you get a show that, from a singular point of divergence from the history that we are aware of today, creates this really cool branch where sometimes you have things that seem to line up with history as we know it, but then there's a whole set of other parts of the story that diverge in interesting ways. Talk to me a little bit more about how you understand singular points of divergence.
Yeah, so just, it's just, as we were just kind of talking about the many worlds idea, right? I think it's natural. It's harder, I think, to comprehend like all the different ways that a world could be different. I think it's easier to start with, well, what's that one choice? What if that one choice had gone differently? Right. Or one event, or maybe it's not a choice, but one event. Right. So For All Mankind, they trace it back to the death of a single person in the Soviet space program. And they posit that he doesn't die of whatever heart attack or whatever it was, I forget exactly. And so therefore the space program in the Soviet Union remains on track and competitive. And so they compete in the race to the moon, and it really unfurls from there. It gets quite divergent, but it kind of traces back to that one point. There's one of the stills I have in here. It's the movie Sliding Doors, which isn't a particularly sci-fi or multiversal movie, but it does embrace that question of that one moment where she either gets on a subway train or doesn't, because she just barely makes it through the doors before they close, or she doesn't. And her being Gwyneth Paltrow's character, and her whole life unfolds very differently. Her marriage, her relationships, they all spiral in different directions because of that one moment at a very crucial time. And so I think we're kind of it's easy to write a story about those moments. It's easy to, and I think we're just we are very fascinated by that idea that there are these crucial moments in our lives where everything hinges on it, and it can be both good and bad, right? It can be nice to think about, well, what how good did things turn out because I made the right choice, or it can be devastating to think about how bad have things gone because I made the wrong choice, and we'll never really know. And those counterfactuals can be both a blessing and a curse, or a real attention drain. But we can't seem to help ourselves.
Well, no, we can't. And one of the fun, I talked about mirrors a bit ago, but when we think about flipped worlds, one of the shows that I love is Star Trek, and Star Trek does this flipped world thing all the time. It's part of the continuity to talk about the mirror universe, and how these realities sometimes connect. So talk to me a little bit about how the flipped world framework or concept works.
Yeah, I mean, it could diverge from a single point, right? Like the stories we're talking about, but oftentimes it's much more comprehensive than that, right? So you have these morality alignment shifted worlds where all the good guys are bad guys and vice versa. And the Star Trek Mirrorverse kind of gets into that, and that's where you get the evil twin has the goatee motif, right? But you also you have things like the DC universe. I think it's Earth 3. There's a Justice League that's called the Crime Syndicate, right? So it's all the characters from the Justice League Superman and Wonder Woman and Batman and so forth, but they're all evil, right? So that's probably not a single event. I don't know if I know the full history of how the Earth 3 came to be the way that it is. But it doesn't feel like there's a single event you can point back to. It's sort of like a whole orientation of that world is different. Another popular way to flip things around is gender flipping, right? So we had, for example, the Ghostbusters movie that came out about 8 years ago, where all the characters, all the main characters are similar in personality and play similar roles in the story, but their genders are flipped. And so again, that's not a single event. That's the birth of many different separate people that would have to go differently.
Right.
And so it just kind of it's that easy compare and contrast kind of thing. We'll take one variable and change it as opposed to one event, right? One something about our alignment, and we think so naturally in these kind of binary axes, male, female, good, bad, so forth, and so it's a natural thing to just kind of flip them in general, flip the whole axis, and see how do things play out in that way.
One of the multiversal stories that all of my kids have been able to geek out about together is Spider-Man Into the Multiverse. We watched that movie, and both myself and my three sons were like, "This is one of the best things we have seen ever," or at least in the recent years moving up to that movie. And so part of what's so fun is you get to see realities like cartoon. I mean, so it's a kind of cartoon within a cartoon, but where you think, wow, we've got like Spider Pig or Spider Ham or whatever he's called, and that's like so it's not just this flipped world reality; it's like radically different. So talk to me a little bit about the radically different reality idea.
Yeah, I mean, the first example that came to mind was the one you just mentioned, the Spider Ham, right, where you've got a whole universe populated by these anthropomorphic animals, and it's not just that rabbits or birds or whatever became sapient instead of apes, right? Because there's all different kinds of animals here, cats and dogs and alligators and pigs and ants and so forth. Like, every character is represented by an animal that either reflects something about their personality or just provides a good opportunity for a pun on their name or something like that. And so there, the logic is more about the jokes than the cause and effect. How did this universe come to be this way? Isn't the right question to be asking. But it's more like, what would it be like in this very different world? And so it's asking, how would you function, or what would life be like in this very different setting? So you've also got worlds where dinosaurs became sapient instead of humans, or Flatland, which is not necessarily a multiverse story, but it's again one of these stories that's asking us to imagine a very different world where there's only 2 dimensions of space instead of 3. What is that like? And how do we understand how the rules work there? And then how does, can we think about what that might imply for if, there were actually more dimensions than the 3 that we experience? Or things like the paint world that Doctor Strange crashes through in his Multiverse of Madness montage, right? There's no explanation. How does that world work? What does it even mean to be an organism in a world where everything's made of paint? Like, I don't know. It's just an interesting visual, right? That, and so sometimes we just want to give free rein to our creativity and just to, try to think of something as different as possible from our own, either just to, ask questions about what does that say about our own experience, or just to, just for the fun of thinking about something so different.
I just hope that someone from Marvel is watching this or listening to this, and that someone will give me like a full Avengers movie with the alligator Loki someplace in there. I mean, at least a full Thor storyline with alligator Loki in there. That's just It's got to be done. I want to see it. I'm going to show up for it.
It's a fun visual. There are comics, so a movie can only be so far down the road.
Oh my gosh! All right, so let's talk about things like fixed points. So we've referenced this here. So you've got singular beings are a certain kind of fixed point. So singular beings, and then you've got singular events as well. So let's start by talking about singular beings. How does that work in this conversation?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it does or not, but it's an idea that comes up in the fiction. I'm most familiar with it in the Marvel Comics world, where they have a whole multiverse, but they say that they claim that some characters are unique in the multiverse, that there's only one of them in all the multiverse. And I think Rachel Summers or Rachel Gray was the first one of those, and might still be the only one. I'm not sure. It's a little bit hard to research because different writers have different ideas about these things. But it's definitely something I've encountered about her. Right, is that she might be unique across the multiverse. And while I've always struggled to think about how that works in that fictional setting. It did strike me as being relevant here. Thinking about the C.S. Lewis, space trilogy, and the sufficiency of Jesus' sacrificial death, right? And so the way that Lewis handles that is, well, it doesn't feel right for Jesus to have to go to different planets and die, once on each planet. It should be sufficient for the solar system, and so you get these stories about Mars and about Venus, where there's a very different relationship between God and Jesus and the inhabitants of those planets. As a result, they don't have the same kind of, incarnational story that we have on Earth, but they are impacted by that event. But that event, they're impacted by the Earth event, not by one on their planet. And so that got me thinking, well, we might want to entertain that idea about Jesus as well in a multiverse context. Again, not sure how that works, but it seemed like a relevant thing to bring up.
Well, I mean, boy, there's a lot of theology that can be talked about there. I mean, just the thought of, high Christology means that Jesus could mean having a high Christology could mean that Jesus's death is for the sin, the fallenness of everything, right? And you begin to wonder if C.S. Lewis and other thinkers who talk about this thing come a little close to the theologian Origen in his conversation about what's wrought from Christ's sacrifice, the death and resurrection. And so the theologian Origen moves us to the place of universal salvation, because of that work. And so you think about that universal salvation moving across all the created reality. Is that a possibility? And remember, that was the going thinking for or predominant thinking for a few centuries of the church before we took a different theological turn. But we can come back to that. So you've got singular being that can whose presence can have ripple effects across all reality. And then you've got canon events. So Spider-Man's big on this whole canon event thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, that as a term, I think that was only just first introduced last year in the Across the Spider-Verse movie. Mm-hmm. But obviously, as a concept, it goes back, like I said, to the Bible and probably other, ancient thinking as well, that there are certain events that are just going to happen, even if they take different paths to get there. Right. So in Spider-Man, the examples are things like, the Peter Parker or somebody's going to get bit by that radioactive spider and get spider powers in every universe.
Right.
And whoever that happens to is going to experience some kind of traumatic death of a close loved one that will spur them towards heroism, and so forth. And so, people have different ways of explaining that, right? That just time or the universe wants these things to happen. We could say that God wants these things to happen or is causing these things to happen. We can just say that, this space of possibilities, branches in certain ways and comes back together in certain ways. And that just, you can't imagine, because of the constraints of cause and effect, not everything can happen independent of everything else. I think about, it makes me think about the game Plinko. I don't know if you've ever, on The Price is Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, if you drop from a single point, if you always drop from a single point and drop a bunch of little things, more of them will wind up in the middle than on the edges. They'll actually form, they'll form visibly the normal distribution, right? If you do a whole bunch of these. And so that's because there are more paths that lead to those middle spots than there are paths that lead to the outer edges. Now, obviously in Plinko, you can start at any point, and so that changes the thing. But if you're always starting from the same place, there are more paths that lead to the center spots at the bottom than on the edges. And so time and the possibilities of reality might have similar constraints, right? That there are some events that there are just more paths that wind up there or that go through there than there are others. Yeah.
Well, and Doctor Who has this concept of fixed. I think it's called fixed moments in time.
Right.
So there are certain things that just cannot be messed with, or it unravels everything else. And so, whereas the Time Lord or the Time Lords might have some discretion to tinker with certain amount of variables, you can't affect a fixed moment in time. And like the pillars of reality in that universe. Well, let's talk for theology, and I'm going to try to self-govern myself here because I could just go on for a bit here. But let's start with Jesus and what are Jesus's essential attributes as we think about Jesus's personhood. Is maleness essential? Is Jewishness essential? Is him being a member of a sapient species essential? What's essential in Jesus's personhood? What do you think?
Yeah, what really started kind of tickling out my brain thinking about this question was, what about a world where there's more than one sort of sapient species, right? So, it wasn't that long ago that we had Neanderthals and Denisovans as well as Homo sapiens. And, if we encountered those people, we might not, based on their behavior and interacting with and so forth, obviously we wouldn't have the language communication and so forth, but if we could observe them, and if we might not recognize that they were, separate groups, right? We might think of them all as humans. And so what if they persisted, right? What does it mean that Jesus was a Homo sapiens and not a Neanderthal? If we still had, Neanderthals that we lived with and, maybe worked alongside, traded with, they also had our language and so forth. Or, you've got these stories where, it's gorillas or orangutans or something like that gives rise to a sapient species that can talk and think abstractly in the way that we do. Well, what if that happened multiple times, right? What if there were descendants of chimps or a chimp-like animal like us, and descendants of gorillas or orangutans that were also had those human qualities of understanding? And so, what would it mean for Jesus to be incarnated as one of those and not the other? That was kind of a struggle for me to think about, because I can imagine a wide latitude of, in a world where the dinosaurs became sapient, Jesus would become incarnated as a dinosaur, right? That I can kind of appreciate that, or in a world where the God's chosen people, right? Does there need to be a group of chosen people like the Israelites? And does Jesus need to be one of those, right? Are those kind of fixed notions? Possibly not. I don't know. But yeah, this idea that, well, what if there's multiple groups that would all kind of see themselves as equally sort of moral beings and capable of a relationship with God in the same way. That's where that's kind of the puzzle that I kind of got stuck on a little bit on this question.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of what it means to reflect the imago Dei, right, the image of God, and I think that in Scripture, as we have it, that God seems to enjoy regularly enough challenging our presumptions in ways that continue to press us toward a clear sense of what it means to love God, love neighbor, love God's creation. So there are certain things that I think in Scripture are fixed in certain kinds of ways. These larger conversations that God seems to be driving us toward. But in so many cases, when something is manifest, the people seem to go, that didn't exactly happen the way I expected it. So in that way, God keeps driving us toward the same kinds of conversation or understanding, the same wisdom. But in other ways, God keeps us guessing. Mm-hmm. And so it makes me think, I don't know, God just might keep us guessing related to the how Jesus shows up in different realities.
Yeah. It reminds me, one way I've thought about, that one of the big themes of Scripture is that God's people are continually encountered with the question, oh wait, is the kingdom of God for these people too, or are these people? Can these people also be part of the kingdom of God for various different kinds of people, groups of people, and so forth? And the answer is always yes. And sometimes that could be, sometimes that's challenging, and sometimes that's easier to embrace. And so I can get on board with we might just have to continue that pattern into the multiverse.
Right. Well, what do you think about Jesus's ministry? How might Jesus's ministry be impacted by the multiversal conversation? You got disciples, you've got miracles, you've got operating in and outside hierarchies. I mean, we think about how might Jesus' ministry be affected by this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have great answers, but just kind of thinking about, okay, what are some of the possibilities, right? That, is there a lone wolf Jesus who doesn't have disciples? That's kind of hard to imagine. You can imagine different kinds of disciples, right? Different people, they have different names, they have different jobs, they relate to Jesus in different ways, but it's hard to imagine that Jesus wouldn't want to, or that. And we keep saying Jesus as if this person in the multiverse might not have different names too, right? But right. We'll use that for convenience. But it's hard to imagine that Jesus wouldn't seek out those kinds of relationships in some way. That seems like a pretty core kind of thing. The same thing with the miracles, right? That sure there'd probably be different kinds of things, right? Different things would be meaningful to different cultures, different places and times. But taking the view that John gives us of that these things are signs, so that we would understand that they're more about illustrating who Jesus is and represents, as opposed to they're not just about, well, that person was hungry and that was the way to fix it, and so that seems like there would be some amount of that, but it might look very different, right? But yeah, and then I'm just kind of wondering, like, what if the God came incarnate as the Emperor of Rome, or as the King Herod, or something, or whoever, the equivalent thereof, right? Like, is that an essential part of who Jesus was? That and his ministry was that sort of more operating on the fringes, operating outside of the patterns. That one I'm less clear on. Maybe it could work, maybe it couldn't. I don't know. I wouldn't want to say that God couldn't work in a certain way. But there are two
major paradigms as we think about God's nature, now that I at least want to lift up for this conversation. So there's an understanding of God's nature. So we think about God as Trinity and unity here. And so if God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, so there's something that is fixed about God's nature, then how God shows up and manifests God's character in connection with God's creation, there are consistent themes there. So if that's the case, that you're going to, if God is constantly doing what we see in our scriptural texts, like turning things upside down, and so rather than going to the older brother, going to the younger brother, rather than going to the rich, going to the poor, if God's constantly turning things upside down, perhaps this will be consistent throughout the time. If God is Trinity and unity, and so God creates people for community, the idea, as you say, of lone wolf Jesus just doesn't quite make sense. There was another theological tradition. It had its rise perhaps in the early 20th century, and is now dormant in so many places in the theological tradition. But this was the sense that a process theology talks about God and God's very self changing. So God is in process, just as creation is in process. So what is one of the most true things about creation? Well, it is change. We'd even say that now. Things change, we change, seasons change. Change is something that's deeply true. Well, what this process theology says is that's also true of God. And so in that way, if God in Trinity is changing, perhaps God in Trinity could change across these multiple the multiverse.
Right.
That's really interesting to think about. So then you could say, well, maybe Jesus does show up as a lone wolf, or maybe Jesus does show up as an emperor because of that changing nature of God in process theology.
Right.
Really interesting to think about.
Yeah, that is an interesting idea. It also makes me kind of think about, if God is sort of the supreme being worthy of worship, praise, so forth, right? Does that require that God manifest in all the possible ways that God could be to maximize the ways in which he can be glorified, right? So that you have to have all these different, in fact, that I could see that, I think Christians are sometimes wary of the multiverse for a variety of reasons, but that could be, a theological point in favor of the multiverse, right? That it maximizes the opportunities for God to be glorified, both in the numbers and kinds of beings that are glorifying God, and the number and kinds of things that God is doing that can be glorified.
Right, boy, the heavenly host, the host of folks who are praising God really does take so many more possible inflections, related to that. So then, I mean, we kind of touch on this. How does this affect Jesus's mission in the world? So how does this affect Jesus' identity and character and ministry? So, well, and how does that then have implications for Jesus's mission in the world? Does it require sacrifice? Would the cross be necessary in all of these realities? Would the resurrection be necessary in all of these realities? We're going to get into the little messy edges of Jesus Christ Superstar. Would Jesus need to be single in all of these iterations? What do you think? How would this affect Jesus's mission?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think we kind of come back to the same kinds of answers, right? That we can make a case for there are fixed points because God has to be a certain way, or we could make the case for God has to explore all the possibilities. It's easier for me. I can imagine again, kind of that what are the variations? I can imagine various different kinds. There might be a world in which the Romans don't invent crucifixion, or whoever it is, right, doesn't invent crucifixion, and so there isn't a cross, but there's some other kind of public form of execution. But that seems more consistent than the idea of a Jesus who dies peacefully in his sleep at the age of 95 or something like that, right? Does that death accomplish the same kind of sacrifice in the same way? And I suppose that touches on what is one's atonement theory, and what are the different ideas of what actually was going on the cross. What does atonement mean and represent? Is it a culturally specific thing about the blood sacrifice that was instituted for the Israelites that might look very, very different in it for a different kind of chosen people in a different universe, or is that all essential to God's character and nature? Those are more in your wheelhouse, but it seems to me that that's the questions that one quickly will run into.
Yeah, I mean this idea of Jesus redeeming sin. How does this need to be done? Like you say, is it a culturally specific kind of blood sacrifice? The question of could redemption happen by another way is one of the questions that is oft asked, has been asked across the centuries, related to theories of the atonement. But I think you could even go a bit further here, and I know we've not talked about this yet, but if we're looking at the multiverse of possibilities, we've got to ask, well, we're sitting in the Garden of Eden, and God says, hey, look, the tree, don't mess with that one. And Adam and Eve say, okay.
Yeah, good point.
Right. And so at that point, how might this affect things? Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't a second person of the Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
And that this second person of the Trinity may not walk in the garden, if you will, with humanity in various ways. But that could be a very different story. In fact, it's a story that we anticipate will be the case in new creation. So in some ways, it's good for us to imagine that story, because that's the story that we feel that we're moving to in new creation. But without the need for new Genesis, if in the first Genesis there was it worked differently, the mission of Jesus could be quite different.
Yeah. Now we're back to Lewis, right? I mean, that's a big part of the space trilogy is exactly those kinds of questions going all the way back to that point. Yeah.
So let's we must press on to a close. This is really so exciting. All this conversation. The question of whether the incarnation is a singular event, once and for all things, all creation. I mean, does the incarnation, and we're around the time of Christmas, and so the incarnation is at the top of our minds here, our social consciousness as Christians, hopefully. How does this whole multiversal conversation impact the thinking around the incarnation as a singular event, or Jesus being a singular event, singular person?
Yeah, and here I think it really matters what kind of multiverse we're talking about, right? If we're talking about the infinite expanse of the space-time that we occupy, you could perhaps entertain the idea that, Jesus, the incarnation happened once here on Earth, and that is sufficient for all of the space-time with which we are continuous. And how that, travels to those other parts that, where light can't even reach, I don't know, but one could entertain that, I think. Whereas if you're talking about like the branching many worlds model, the quantum many worlds model, right, then there are multiple branches of the timeline, and Jesus died, the branch before the incarnation, and so they and then branch during Jesus's life and ministry and so forth, and so right, there have to be kind of multiple incarnation events on those different branches, or Jesus exists on multiple branches of the wave function. Or at least it seems like maybe my imagination is too limited here, or I don't understand the physics quite well enough. But it feels like it's a little bit more like it's hard to avoid that Jesus is impacting multiple, is existing on multiple branches of that wave function in that way.
I tend to, as far as my imagination can go, and I think part of the conversation is how far can we imagine here with the beautiful reality and notion that God's imagination is so much more vast than us. So if we are talking about a multiverse, oh, how splendid and oh, how expansive this multiverse must be because God's imagination is not so limited as ours. But I think this idea of the incarnation happening in every universe is a strong possibility, and with the idea that free will that not only we experience but is experienced across the multiverse, unless you have portions of the multiverse where free will is stripped away, that doesn't seem very consistent with the character of the God that we have. Then at some place there's going to need to be a mitigation of the challenges that arise from free will. Mm-hmm. And that people don't always, people or whatever creatures, whatever entities don't always get it right. And so the necessity of this singularity of Jesus seems to be to help take what is become so misaligned through the poor exercise of that free will and help to align it again. And so it just makes sense to me that there would be some kind of incarnation across these multiverses.
Yeah, and maybe that's part of the emptying of God, the emptying of himself that happens as a part of the incarnation is choosing or allowing God's self to be limited by the speed of light, for example, right? And so we can't communicate with the other, Hubble volumes in our space-time, and so there needs to be another incarnation in that Hubble volume so that those people can know too.
Ooh. Yes, dude, I like that. Man, there's so many things that we could continue to talk about related to this, but it is time to begin to wrap it up. We've got an extra question that will be for subscribers at the end. And this question is, there's a Parliament of Doom, the Congress of Reeds, and the Council of Kang. What would a gathering of multiversal Jesuses be called? A great question. All right, so recommendations. Hey, do you have any recommendations for our listeners? What should they be checking out?
Yeah, I already plugged my own book, so I will plug another book. We'll see if the camera cooperates more with this one. There we go. The Infinity Gate by M.R. Carey. It's the first of 2 books. I think Echoes of Time is a sequel. It is all about the multiverse. I've mentioned it before on the podcast, but I think Carrie does an excellent job of synthesizing a lot of the different ideas from sci-fi, certainly, and also somewhat from the science about the multiverse, what the implications of that are, what that would look like, and is not just limiting himself to a single point of divergence, but exploring all kinds of different divergences at all different points in time, and then how that would come together. Just a lot of imagination and a really great story and fun characters along with that. So that's my recommendation.
So that's a great recommendation. So I don't have necessarily a multiversal recommendation for everyone, but I do have a fun sci-fi recommendation. So there is a writer by the name of Brian Sigmund, and Brian, I have been friends for many years, and Brian has a PhD in Old Testament, has been involved in publishing, and is also a writer. So he's got a couple books out, Archimedes and the Messiah Bot, an alternative account of the singularity. Both books are really fun. Check out this new sci-fi writer, Brian Sigmund. Now, with no direct relation, I don't think, I also want to give a big thanks to supporter Daniel Sigmund, who has been supporting Systematic Geekology. Remember, if you'd like your own shout out to you, you can support our show with an offering of $3 a month on Apple Podcasts, Captivate, or Patreon, and we would love to give you a shout out. All right, before we go, let me remind that we are all a chosen people, a geekdom of priests.
Merry Christmas, everybody, and Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas.
Did you know Systematic Geekology has a YouTube channel? Now you do. And while you're there, you can see exclusive stuff like our comic book catch-up series, Manga Mustard, Drinks with Tejas, the companion series to our annual theme. You can go Friday Night Frights with me, where I go through cryptozoology, ufology, and more. You can also go to see Spidey Swing Bys, where I'm doing every chronological appearance by release of Spider-Man from Amazing Fantasy 15 all the way to the modern age. You can also find exclusive shorts on YouTube there, as well as other bonuses for extra episodes that we do that don't end up on the podcast proper. So I want to see you over there on YouTube.
Hi, my name is TJ, and I'm here to tell you about the Anazal Ministry Podcast Network. We have a bunch of shows on AMP. You can follow the entire network in a single feed on Spotify at Anazal Ministry Podcasts or on the network page on Apple Podcasts. Some of the ones we're running right now are the Homily, which is Pastor Will's homily messages from Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Chapel Hill. We have the Whole Church Podcast, which one of my favorites. It's where myself and Joshua, we interview leaders from different denominations and backgrounds to work for a full church unity, Big C. We have My Seminary Life by Brandon Knight, former host on Systematic Geekology. He discusses his experience at seminary and discusses seminary topics so anyone can access the knowledge, which is kind of cool. It's like the book, Everything You Learn at Business School and then Everything You Don't Learn at Business School. It's great. We have Let Nothing Move You by Christian Ashley. He goes through the Bible kind of like it's a Bible study to explain the biblical narrative through his perspective and what he's learned. Dummy for Theology, which is Joshua's show, he discusses various theological topics in an attempt to show every side of big discussions. That leaves you with more questions than answers, which everyone loves a lot. It's kind of a continuation of a series that we did on Whole Church, but it's really good. It's really fun. We have the Bible After Hours, where the foul-mouthed preacher goes through the Bible from a progressive view to challenge the status quo of the modern church. I love that one. If you're from a more conservative background, that one I find will probably be the most helpful for you. Definitely check that out. And we have the Clydes. Taylor and Elizabeth Clyde go through weekly discussions in a devotional, conversational method to help us get closer to one another and God. That's just a little review of what we do in AMP and all of our other shows. So check that out, get subscribed, and just start getting all that free content.